Peter, I've been walking. Obviously, I'm a news junkie. I'm always trying to figure out what's going on. I cover a wide breadth of media, and there seems to be a lot of questions about the severity of the inflation that we're experiencing, how long it's going to last, and actually where it's coming from. I know this is your one of your great specializations, and I compliment you. I see you all the time on a variety of programs. What is your take here? Because if I can just add the little salt and pepper to it, it's been politicized as well, as usual. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, you laid it out correctly in the intro. Inflation is a tax, and the source is government, because that's who taxes us. The only way to reduce inflation would be to dramatically cut government spending, because government spending is being paid for through inflation. We're running record budget deficits. And so instead of taking our money and spending it, the government is taking our purchasing power by printing new money and spending that. So the increase in prices that we're all experiencing is the tax that we are paying to finance government. In addition, the Federal Reserve is trying to prop up the stock market, prop up the real estate market, and prop up the U.S. government. It can only do that by keeping interest rates artificially low. But in order to do that, the Fed has to keep printing money to buy bonds. So as long as the Fed is artificially suppressing interest rates, it is going to have to create inflation to do it. And because we have so much debt, the Fed is now forced to keep interest rates at zero. So unfortunately, average Americans, the middle class and the working poor are going to suffer the most severe bout of inflation in U.S. history, far greater than anything experienced during the decade of the 1970s.
Is the Fed being responsible here? Because, I mean, it's just not over the last 14 months or so that we've seen increased huge injections here. We've seen a lot of really easy money for a long time now, and then it got supercharged. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah. Well, remember, the Federal Reserve is never responsible. So why should they change now? But remember, one of the other things the Fed is never is honest, right? The Fed is all about spin. It's all about trying to. So if you recall, early in the mortgage crisis, when the subprime market blew up and the threat to the entire mortgage market was obvious, as was the threat to the economy, what did the Federal Reserve do? They came out and reassured everybody that there was nothing to worry about, that the subprime problems were contained. Why did they do that? Because they were hoping that by denying that the problem existed, maybe they could somehow will it out of existence and somehow get people to change their behavior in the face of what should have been an obvious crisis, and they were hoping to avert it. And I think they're doing the same thing now. The Fed has absolutely no ability to fight inflation. So why even acknowledge that it's a threat when you can't do anything about it? So the only thing the Fed can do is deny, lie to the markets, tell everybody that it's all temporary. And that explains their failure to act. But their real failure to act is because it's impossible. Because the only way to fight inflation is to turn off the monetary spigots, to raise interest rates of cards economy that they've erected. We have a worse financial crisis than 2008. The government would be forced to slash spending dramatically. They may even have to default on the national debt. Who knows what would happen if the Fed actually fought inflation? So because they can't, they're just denying the problem. But there is absolutely no evidence to suggest what we're really experiencing is the beginning of a long overdue, huge increase in the cost of living, not only the result of the inflation that the Fed has created since the pandemic, but of all the inflation that we created before the pandemic. Right. that we've yet to deal with.
Peter, you know, we've talked about how economists look at this. We have 3 economists on the panel here, and all of you make a lot of perfect sense to me, but it's really a political problem at the end of the day, because a lot of promises have been made, promises are going to be made here. It's about how we get out of this crisis here, and the powers that be have decided you spend your way out, okay? And all 3 of you have enumerated so far in this program the immense dangers of it. And they don't have the downside like the rest of us, okay? Working people, they're the ones that are going to suffer the most. And there will be a backlash. At least 3 of us here, remember the 1970s and stagflation. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, of course it is political. I mean, the Biden administration, every member of Congress wants to give the voters something for nothing, right? The government wants to make sure that all the people who don't have jobs, many of them, of course, are just choosing not to have jobs, but the government wants to make sure that they have plenty of money to spend, even though they didn't earn that money, even though they didn't help produce any goods or provide any services. The government wants to give them money to buy goods and services. Well, where's the money coming from? They're not raising taxes. They're just spending the money. And so the money is being created. It's being conjured into existence by the Federal Reserve. But that is inflation. You see, every single dollar that the federal government spends, the American public has to cover the cost. And so if they're not going to take our money through taxation, they're going to take our purchasing power through inflation. And so they print all this money, the government spends the money, but the Federal Reserve prints the money, and it goes into the economy. And now as non-productive, unemployed people go to buy stuff they didn't help produce, all that happens is the price goes up. And it's amazing that people don't understand, or they expect that we can have all this stimulus, all this government for free. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Government spending is going to keep getting worse. And of course, as government spends more, it weakens the economy, which means even more spending. Inflation is going to go through the roof. And we keep talking about the 1970s. What we're going to experience is going to be far worse. And in fact, it probably already is worse than the 1970s. If we were using the CPI that existed back then to measure prices right now, we would see that the CPI is already rising at a faster rate than it ever did in the 1970s, and we're just going up from here.
What we see here with all of this cash injections here is this huge. I mean, we talked about like the housing bubble, but I think almost every sector is turned into a bubble right now. It's really quite terrifying watching it here. The amount of money that is being pumped in over the last 14 months, it's hard to comprehend, and it's out there, and it's just not housing. It's just not one sector. It seems to me this is like a perfect storm to collide. Go ahead, Peter.
Oh, sure. Because of the Federal Reserve and these reckless monetary policies, just about every single financial asset is dramatically mispriced. And that has, tremendous distortions in the economy and massive negative implications. Just look at the bond market. Look at the yield on a 10-year U.S. Treasury, which is below 1.5%. It's like 1.4%. Inflation is 5 times that. And look at the yield. There's no way that yield reflects reality. It reflects fantasy. And everything is priced to fantasy. You have the extreme examples in meme stocks or cryptocurrencies, but the Fed has done tremendous damage. And there is no savior on the horizon that's going to do the right thing like Paul Volcker, because the consequences of doing the right thing are so horrific at this point that they're never going to be tried. But of course, the consequences of continuing to do the wrong thing are even more horrific, but that's what's going to happen because politicians don't give a damn about that. All they want to do is kick the can down the road as long as they can. They don't care if they make the problem worse, just so long as it blows up later rather than sooner. And that is what is going to happen. But I think on the emerging markets, they are going to finally be the big beneficiaries because we're going to print the dollar into oblivion. The dollar is going to crash. Yeah. And then what's going to happen is a lot of the goods that are being sent to the United States are no longer going to come to the United States because nobody here will be able to afford to buy them. And so all those goods that are produced abroad will stay abroad. And so prices will come down for people in emerging markets as their currencies go way up and things become cheaper for them as Americans get priced out of all these markets because our currency is going to lose so much value that we can no longer afford to buy the things that we're buying now.